The Pathans by Olaf Caroe, Chapter 8, Saffarids and Hindu Shahis. By the end of the 2nd century of the Islamic era, the strength of the Arab thrust towards the east was spent. Spiritually, the appeal of Islam continued to spread and win new converts throughout the Iranian and Turkish worlds. But in the east, the Arab as conqueror had shot his bolt. From now on, the sword and the Quran were to be entrusted to other hands. The new impetus came from Sijistan. 1. It appeared first in sectarian form under the Kharijites, but in reality it was a rallying of Iranian consciousness, spurred to new life by the message from the Arabian desert, but impatient of Arab control and seeking its own forms of expression and action. Sijistan is far from Gandhara and the Suleiman Mountains, and its inhabitants, though East Iranian, are not Afghan. But it is necessary to bring events on the Helmand into the account for 2 reasons. The first is that the new impetus given to the cause of Islam from the centre of Zaranj was the force that carried its banners forward to the eastern limits of the old Sasanian Empire and into the Indus Valley. The second, that it was under the Saffarids, a Sijistan dynasty, that we first hear of Khalji mercenaries. For this period, there is a source of capital importance entitled Tarikh-e-Sistan, History of Sistan, discovered and edited in Tehran about the year 1930. It is a composite chronicle showing 3 different styles, the earliest by internal evidence written in the time of the Saffarid dynasty in the 9th century, 3rd Hijri century. It bears every evidence of authenticity and, being in Persian, is in much fuller detail than any of the Arab chronicles which deal with events on the eastern confines of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Arab power in the east was brought down by the Kharijite rebellion, which had its chief rallying ground in the Sijistan region. The Kharijites were Quranic fundamentalists, opposed to all the more orthodox elements in the Muslim world, Sunni and Shia alike. Later they adopted many bizarre doctrines, among them that merit was the only true qualification for leadership. Their leader adopted the title of Amir-ul-Mu'minin, Commander of the Faithful, and incorporated in his formula the slogan, Wala hukma illa lillah, there is no order but of God. They lived in mountain and desert as bandits, appointed anti-caliphs, and succeeded at times in defeating Abbasid armies in pitched battles. It was due to their prowess that the Arab governors of Sijistan were unable to control anything outside Zaranj and Bust without taking armies into the field. In Sijistan, they assumed the character of a national and popular movement directed against Arab domination and taxation. The people of the country regarded them with sympathy, provided that they directed their atrocities against Arabs or non-Muslims. The climax was reached in 797, H. 181, when the Kharijite Hamza not only drove the caliph's forces into the garrison cities, but declared the abolition of the tribute and land revenue and put to death the Abbasid revenue agents. This was the end of regular payment of tribute to Baghdad. The Tariq quotes verbatim an obviously authentic exchange of letters between the Caliph Harun al-Rashid and Hamza, in which the Caliph rebukes the rebel for un-Muslim behaviour, and Hamza sends a conciliatory yet dignified reply, citing in conclusion the slogan I have given above. This Tariq also remarks that Hamza founded the town of Gardez, a point confirmed in the 10th century Hudud al-Alam II, which says, "The inhabitants of Gardez are Kharijites." Gardez is the chief centre of the Zurmat Valley, only a few miles west of Khurram and coast, and not far from the Durand Line on the Afghan side. Kharijite connections with this part of the Pathan country not only show that Hamza extended his authority far to the east of Sijistan, but may help to explain certain religious deviations from orthodoxy, which we shall later have occasion to notice in the Turis and other Kalanri Pathan tribes in that neighbourhood. By the beginning of the 3rd Islamic century, say about AD 850, the governorate of Sijistan, weakened by the Kharijite revolt, had become a mere outpost of the Baghdad Caliphate in which the central government's authority was very remote. The Rutbil was still ruling the territory east of Bust. He and the Kabul Shah sometimes paid a nominal tribute to Zaranj, but they were virtually independent, and they remained unconverted. As for the mountain areas of the Suleiman Massif, the degree of Muslim penetration is revealed in an interesting manner by one of the oldest of all inscriptions of the Muslim era, discovered in 1907 in the Tochi Valley and now in the Peshawar Museum. 3. Its chief interest lies in the date, which is quite clear, H. 243, AD 857, and in the fact that it is bilingual in Sanskrit and Arabic. The scripts used are the Sarada, an early form of Nagri, for Sanskrit, and the Kufic for Arabic. The inscription records the construction of a building by a person whose name is preserved in the Arabic text, but was apparently not an Arab, for the form is unfamiliar and cannot be read. Although the full details cannot be deciphered, the interest lies in the proof afforded that both Sanskrit and Arabic were current in the Tochi in the last years of the Abbasid Caliphate in Sijistan, and just before the emergence of Yaqub-i-Lais, the first of the Saffarids. Yaqub-i-Lais the Saffar, coppersmith or brazier, was born in a Sijistan village and served an apprenticeship in the trade, after which he was nicknamed. For a time, he took to the roads as a highwayman, and later joined the service of Salih ibn al-Nasr, who, in recognition of the opposition he showed to the Kharijites, was acknowledged by Baghdad in 852, H. 238. 6 years later, al-Nasr's brother, who had succeeded him, abdicated in favour of Yaqub, who had become commander of the army, and in 861, H. 247, Yaqub was proclaimed Emir of Sijistan. In the course of the next few years, he campaigned successfully against the Kharijites of Kerman, against Herat, and much more important from our point of view, against Rutbil of Ar-Rukaj and the Shah of Kabul. The Tariq informs us that during this campaign, Yaqub founded the city of Ghazni, as Hamza had founded Gardez before him. In 870, H. 257, he captured the city of Kabul, and sent as presents to the Caliph at Baghdad an idol he had taken from the great temple there, together with other trophies from Bamiyan. In 872, H. 259, he crossed the Hindu Kush from the south and seized Balkh, returning apparently by Persian Khorasan and putting an end to a dynasty of Tahirids in Nishapur. For the first time, the northern and the southern axis of advance had been joined, and not by an Arab. For the first time, Kabul was fairly reduced and held by Muslim arms, and the Ghazni area brought under administration and a city built. For the first time, too, the Khalaj, to be called in Persian the Khaljis, were successfully brought under subjection and enlisted in Yaqub's armies as mercenaries. One of them, named Subkari, we are told held high military command in Persia, only to contribute subsequently to the downfall of Yaqub's successors by deserting their cause for that of the Caliphate. Yaqub's capture of Kabul in 870 must have been the event that caused the Shahia kings to shift their capital from that city to Waihind, or, as I suggest, Lahore on the Indus. But most unfortunately for the present purpose, very little is available from the sources to throw light on his eastern campaigns. His success in perambulating the circumference of modern Afghanistan aroused in him ambitions for the supreme command. He became hostile to the Caliph, and in 875, H. 262, he marched on Baghdad with a formidable army. It was this dramatic march that caught the attention of the faithful and caused his other campaigns to be overlooked and underrated. He reached within a few miles of the capital, where he was defeated and forced to retreat, dying near Awaz in Khuzestan in 879, H. 266. That Yaqub was an Iranian, not an Arab, is clear from a striking passage in the Tariq. On a convivial occasion, after one of his victories, an Arabic poem was read to him. The emir protested, asking what was the use of reciting something he could not understand, whereupon his secretary began to recite in Persian. The passage proceeds. This was the first time after the Arab conquest that poems were recited in Persian among Persians since the days when the Persians had intoned after the manner of the Sasanians. When the Persians were overthrown by the Arabs, it was the custom always to recite in Arabic. The author then gives an example of the verse recited, of which the first couplet runs, "The Lord has made Mecca the sanctuary for the Arabs, yet thy covenant has established a sanctuary in Iran." The lines are attributed to a Kharijite who accepted an amnesty offered by Yaqub and joined his army. From another source, 5, comes an even more amusing anecdote representing one of the troopers in Yaqub's army speaking to his horse in Persian, though the narrative in this case is in Arabic. When Yaqub first rose to prominence, his enemies decried him as a Kharijite, on the ground that he was self-made, had not been appointed by the Caliph, and was not an Arab. He was at much pains to deny this charge, evidently a sore point with him. It is true that he fought more than one battle against the Kharijites, but he did enlist them in his armies, and his attitude seems to have been equivocal. The fact probably is that he was ready to weld together all unorthodox and local forces, prepared to support his autonomy against the orthodox Arabism of Baghdad. In 879, H. 266, Yaqub was succeeded by his brother Amr, who, in spite of some temporary successes, was unable to consolidate the Saffarid conquests in the east, for the Hindushahis seem to have recovered Kabul and certainly held Ningrahar and Logar. Amr did, however, maintain the dynasty's position in Sijistan and Fars for over 20 years. In the year 900, H. 287, he undertook an expedition against the Samanids, the other Iranian dynasty which had succeeded to the Abbasid power north of the Hindu Kush in 874, H. 261. He was defeated and captured near Balkh and sent in chains to Baghdad, where the Caliph put him to death. The Samanids then attempted to occupy the Saffarid possessions, but were resisted with some success by another member of Yaqub's family, Tahir, who continued to control parts of Fars and Sijistan and even struck coins in Oman across the Gulf. But he was imprisoned by his enemies in 908, H. 296, and, like Amr, sent to Baghdad. Other members of the family maintained themselves in parts of Sijistan for a number of years and seem to have commanded the people's devotion. The region of Ghazni came under a loose and uncertain Samanid control. The career of Yaqub-i-Lais is notable as that of the first Muslim ruler to make the power of Islam effectively felt on the eastern frontier of what had been the Sasanian Empire. He is also probably the first to have enlisted Afghan tribesmen on a large scale in his army, made up mainly of Khalji and others from the region around Ghazni. Many stories are current of his iron discipline, his rough and ready justice which won the affection of uncouth followers from the periphery, and his unfailing alertness in the field. Finally, he is the first to be entitled to speak with justifiable pride of the successful propagation of his faith among the peoples on the eastern frontier, whose religion then included the portrayal of the divine idea in human form. Details are lacking, but the character of Yaqub himself and the path of his conquests indicate that in his time many converts were won for Islam in the Kabul and Ghazni area. Indeed, in almost every respect, Yaqub the Saffarid anticipated the career of Mahmud of Ghazni, whose activities were directed on very similar lines. The main difference is that Yaqub got no further to the east than Kabul, and his conquests, though they disturbed the Hindu rulers of those parts, failed to destroy the principalities themselves. Nevertheless, the Saffarid dynasty played a decisive part in the assimilation of the Afghans and Pathans to the Muslim world, and is for that reason perhaps more deserving of remembrance than the more famous Mahmud, who built on foundations already laid. It is interesting to speculate on what might have happened had Yaqub taken Baghdad as he so nearly did, and so secured control of the caliphate. The Abbasids would have come under tutelage from eastern Iran. Ghaljis and Afghans might have taken the place of Turks as soldiers, and the culture of Baghdad might have developed under some influence from the Pashto language. The Shahia dynasty, from whom Yaqub-i-Lais took Kabul in 870, appears under many names, sometimes merely as Kabul Shahs, again as the Turki Shahia line, again as the Hindu Shahia line of Waihind, and in al-Biruni even as Tibetan. By this he meant Turk or Kushan, which he did not distinguish. It is important to our story, if only as the last non-Muslim line of rulers in Gandhara. The fact that these kings were able to maintain great splendour and dignity in the Peshawar Valley until the opening decade of the 11th century, 400 years after the Hijrat, sufficiently disposes of the uncritical tradition that Islam came early to these parts. Little is known of these kings until on Yaqub's capture of Kabul, the capital of the state was apparently transferred to Waihind in Gandhara beside the Indus, which for reasons given I take to be the site by the present village of Lahore. It is not entirely clear whether the Kabul Shah overcome by Yaqub was of the same line as the founder of the Hindushahis of Waihind, and the change of capital may reflect a change of rulers also. The main documentary evidence to the point is a somewhat confused account, 6, given by al-Biruni, which runs as follows. The last king of this race was Lagaturman, and his wazir was Kala, a Brahmin. The latter had been fortunate insofar as he had found by accident hidden treasures which gave him much influence and power. In consequence, the last king of this Tibetan, Sikh house, after it had held royal power for so long a period, let it by degrees slip from his hands. Besides, Lagaturman had bad manners and a worse behaviour, on account of which people complained of him greatly to the wazir. Now the wazir put him in chains and imprisoned him for correction, but, himself finding ruling sweet, his riches enabled him to carry out his plans, and so he occupied the royal throne. After him ruled the Brahmin kings Samand, Kamalu, Pim, Jaipala, Anandapala, Tarajanapala. The last was killed in H. 412-1021, and his son Pimpala 5 years later. This Hindushahis dynasty is now extinct, and of the whole house there is no longer the slightest remnant in existence. We must say that in all their grandeur they never slackened in the ardent desire of doing that which is good and right, that they were men of noble sentiment and noble bearing. Of which the first and most notable is that al-Biruni was a contemporary writer. He was born in 973, visited India after it had been opened up by the campaigns of Mahmud of Ghazni in 1000 to 1026, and may even have met Jaipal and Anandpal after their defeats at Mahmud's hands. The second point is that the change of dynasty, explained by a very common legend of Eastern story as the supplanting of a king by his minister, may possibly mark the new era caused by the shift of the capital from Kabul to Waihind, Lahore. The passage does at least show that there was a degree of continuity in the history of the dynasty, and that the forerunners of the first Hindu-Shahi king, Khalaj, were outside the Muslim fold. Lastly, although the beginning of al-Biruni's version bears the mark of folklore, as he approaches his own day he inspires more confidence, and he is capable of a fine chivalry in admiring these kings who fought so gallantly against the conqueror of his own faith. There are other touches in the same key, to be noted later when we come to the time of Mahmud. There is, however, another source enabling us to date these shahs with greater accuracy. When Amr-i-Lais, Yaqub's brother, was endeavouring to maintain the Saffarid conquests on the eastern frontier, his deputy at Ghazni or Gardez, named Fardgan, burned a Hindu idol temple at a place called Sakawand on the divide between the Logar and the Zermatt valleys close to the Altamur Pass. The source 7 states that on receiving news of the fall of Sakawand, Kamlu, the Rai of Hindustan, collected a large force and marched towards Zabulistan. This is evidently Kamalu, the third in order of al-Biruni's list of Hindu-Shahis monarchs, who is now seen to have been contemporary with Amr the Saffarid. It follows from this that the first of these kings, called by al-Biruni Kalar, must have been reigning in Kabul before Yaqub-i-Lais captured that city in 870. The evidence of coins is partly confirmatory of al-Biruni and partly at variance. There are many of them, found mostly in the Peshawar Valley and chiefly around the site of Waihind, which we have placed in the neighbourhood of Hund and Lahore close to the Indus. They are mostly small silver pieces bearing upon the obverse an armed horseman, on the reverse a sitting bull. There exist also copper coins with a lion on the obverse and on the reverse an elephant. There is also one gold coin 8 showing 2 kings, Bhimadeva on the obverse and Samantadeva on the reverse, interpreted by Mr. Ajit Gosa as issued in Bhima's reign, but commemorating his predecessor, who, it is suggested, may have abdicated in his favour. But this interpretation ignores the interposition of Kamalu between Samanta and Bhima, and it is more probable that Samanta was regarded as the tutelary genius of the dynasty. The names on all these coins appear in Nagari, Hindu script, and the chronological series is as follows. 1. Spalapati Deva, coins common. 2. Samanta Deva, coins extremely common. 3. Bhima Deva, coins rare. 4. Vakadeva, copper coins common. 5. Kamarayaka, coins very rare, seems to have been converted to Islam. Spalapati, spada equals army in Old Persian, means army commander, and the use of L for D follows the linguistic change we have noted already in comparing the Pashto with the Persian. Of these 5, it will be seen on comparison that only the second and the third, namely Samand and Bhim, incidentally being the 2 on the gold coin mentioned, correspond to al-Biruni's list of Hindu-Shahi kings. It is particularly strange that there are no coins yet found giving the names of Jaipal and Anandpal, authenticated and historical personages who fought battles of known date against Sabuktigin and Mahmud of Ghazni. Conversely, the silence of the literary sources in respect of the first putative Shahi king after the change of dynasty, Spalapati, is extremely puzzling. It can only be assumed that the Brahmin Kala, mentioned by al-Biruni, took the name of Spalapati on accession. It is interesting that the coins bearing Spalapati's name in Nagari often bear also a similar inscription in the Kushan cursive script, indicating that the first Hindu-Shahi was in some sense the inheritor of the Kushan epithalite chancery tradition, and had brought in a more Hinduized form with the change of dynasty, and possibly, though this is uncertain with the change of capital. This disagreement between contemporary chronicler and coin constitutes what may be called the Hindu-Shahia question, a classic source of controversy which has never been satisfactorily solved. 9. The coins of Samand, the second of the line, mentioned both by chronicle and coinage, are to be found in large numbers, and the explanation may lie in the fact that his successors continue to issue coins in his name without troubling to mint new ones. The gold coin mentioned tends to bear out this hypothesis. There is the further surprising fact, never explained, that the Abbasid Caliph, al-Muqtadir, issued coins of the pattern, and, with the types of these Shahi kings in Baghdad about the year 908, H. 295, only superimposing his own name in Arabic. This unparalleled behaviour at least indicates the importance of the Hindushahis and the quality of their coinage in Muslim eyes. It suggests, too, by a comparison of dates, that the first of the line must have been on the throne at the time of, or very shortly after, Yaqub's capture of Kabul in 870, H. 257. There is nothing in what has come down to us in coin or document on the Hindu side which can be said to bear in any way upon the tribes over whom this dynasty ruled. We know that even after the loss of Kabul to the Saffarids, this dynasty held Ningrahar west of the Khyber and also Logar, where, it seems, they were crowned. They themselves and their officials must have been intimately acquainted with all the routes, and the tribes on them, between Kabul and Peshawar, whether direct by the Khyber, by the southern Kurram route, or by the northern route by way of Kunar, Bajar, Talash and Swat. The fact that they ruled in Swat is proved, and incidentally the existence of Jaipal himself is also established, if it were in doubt, by the discovery at Birkot in Swat of an inscription 10 in Sanskrit, written in the Sarada character, beginning with the words, "In the reign of the Supreme Sovereign Superior, King of Great Kings and Supreme Lord, Sri Jayapaladeva." But in face of all this, no hint is given of the condition, or even the identity, of the subjects of the state. It is broadly true to say that from the time of Alexander to that of Babur, no clear picture emerges of the social history or development of the people across whose territory so many invaders passed in the 18 centuries that intervened. There can be no other populated region from the earliest recorded times a boundary between two ancient forms of culture, in respect of which we have to mark so astonishing a gap in knowledge. One shaft of light indeed there is. We have seen the probable earliest reference to the existence of Afghans in the Abgan of the 3rd century Sasanian inscription. Afghans are first referred to within India by the Indian astronomer Varahamihira in his Brat Samhita, written in the 6th century. Xuanzang, the Chinese pilgrim, also mentions a people whom he calls Arpokien in the northern part of the Suleiman Mountains, who can be no other than Afghans. Xuanzang's journeyings to southern Asia took place in the years 629 to 645, and he was in Gandhara in 644, some 20 years before the first Arab raiders reached Alawar, Lahore. The first Muslim references to Afghans are to be found in the Hudud al-Alam 11 of 982, H. 372. This speaks of a village named Saul near Gardez as inhabited by Afghans, and of the region of Ninhar, obviously Ningrahar, the modern Jalalabad district, as a place of which the king makes a show of conversion to Islam, but has over 30 Muslim, Afghan and Hindu wives. The distinction between Muslim and Afghan in this passage is not without significance. Al-Utbi, the historian of the Ghaznavids, and writing early in the 11th century, speaks of Afghans as included in Mahmud's army, and the next succeeding Ghaznavid, Masud, sent his son into the hills near Ghazni to subdue Afghans. But far the most convincing references are contained in al-Biruni's Tariq al-Hind, History of India. As we have seen from his accounts of the Hindushahi kings, al-Biruni was an observer with a broad mind and a shrewd pen. In the mountains to the west of India, he writes, and he is speaking of the period about AD 1000, there live various tribes of the Afghans which extend up to the neighbourhood of the valley of the Sind, Indus. And in a rather earlier passage, he speaks of these tribes as rebellious, savage races occupying the frontiers of India towards the west and extending as far as its furthest limits, which elsewhere he places at Kabul. Furthermore, he designates these tribes as Hindus. He says also that the Indians had previously had kings in Kabul, but the capital in his time was at Waihind. He has a large number of references to Gandhara, the Peshawar valley, which he calls Kandar. He refers also to Peshawar, which he names Parashawar. 12. It will be seen that the Afghan tribes are by this time established just where they are today, east of Kabul and in the mountains as far as the Indus. They are not yet converted, and they are impatient of control. The nomenclature, Pakhtun or Pashtun, does not appear. For that we must wait several more centuries. But almost, we feel, al-Biruni is another Herodotus. For the first time for nearly 1500 years, we are granted a glimpse of the people behind the trappings of dynastic annals. Unfortunately, he gives no names of these rebellious, savage Afghan tribes. For that, we have to wait another 5 centuries for Babur. But we may surmise they would not have been so very different from what they were in Babur's time, and, As we shall see, in Babur's time, most of the tribes occupied the ground they do today. At least from Al-Biruni, we know that by the time of the early Ghaznavids, the Afghans have appeared upon the stage, in the very regions where they now dwell. It had taken many centuries for an organised Muslim power to become established in the neighbourhood of Ghazni, and at the end of the 10th century, there is still a Hindu king ruling on both sides of the Khyber Pass.